Hi everyone, thanks for joining the webinar. We're going to be talking about what's new in the Google Ads API. Let's get started. Just a quick intro, my name is Laura. I'm a developer relations engineer on the Google Ads API team, and I'm based out of the New York office. If you have any questions as we go through the workshop, you can ask them in the Q&A forum linked below the video. Our team will jump in to answer your questions throughout, so feel free to submit your questions anytime, and be sure to upvote other people's questions that are relevant or interesting to you. Before we dive in, a brief overview of what we'll be discussing. We'll start with some of the overarching changes in the Google Ads API. Then we'll go into some of the main paradigm changes, including versioning, gRPC and REST, reporting, the unified data model, strict typing, and restructured requests. After that, I'll get into some of the new features and innovations of the Google Ads API, starting with optimization score and recommendations. Then I'll walk through some of the new ad and campaign types, billing and invoices, new services for retrieving change history and for account management, some improvements to keyword planning and assets, and finally, some new bidding strategies. We'll wrap up with some next steps and the resources available to you for the Google Ads API. All right, let's get right into some of the overarching changes that the Google Ads API brings. Before we get into anything else, a quick reminder that the AdWords API Sunset is coming in April 2022. If you're using the AdWords API today, we advise you to start migrating to the Google Ads API as soon as possible. This is a big undertaking, and we want to help you succeed so that you can take advantage of all the new and improved features of the Google Ads API. With the upcoming sunset, updates to the AdWords API have been put on indefinite hold in favor of more frequent releases in the Google Ads API to streamline the addition of new features, as well as improvements to existing features. We'll now have new version releases every few months or so, and minor version releases in between. You can find announcements for all of those on the blog. In general, we've brought improvements that improve the usability from the AdWords API. The Google Ads API offers clearer error messages, which are more specific and readable to help you debug. There are plenty of new developer resources and tools, including improved and expanded documentation, and some helpful tooling that I'll share examples of in a bit. There's also a unified interface for reporting and mutates, which I'll give more details about later on in the workshop. Then we have more flexible reporting through the new Google Ads query language, and a shift from defined reports to a more flexible and intuitive resource-based paradigm. And lastly, the Google Ads API follows the latest API design standards for a more consistent developer experience across this and other Google APIs. Now I want to talk about some of the paradigm changes that will affect how you work with the Google Ads API in contrast with the AdWords API. Starting with the topic we just touched on, versioning. As I mentioned, the Google Ads API has more frequent releases planned. Another thing to call out on this is the inclusion of minor versions. In the Google Ads API, we now have semantic minor versions, which make it so that you can get new features in a version that's backwards compatible. In other words, you can add new functionality to your implementation without the cost of breaking changes on every upgrade. Have a look at our versioning guide for more details on how semantic versioning works in the Google Ads API. Another paradigm change comes with the introduction of two transport methods, gRPC and REST. In the AdWords API, we had XML over SOAP, which was verbose and quite hard to read. In the Google Ads API, we have two formats, protocol buffers, or protobufs for short, which transport over gRPC, and JSON, which transports over REST. You might recognize this slide if you watched my colleague Sasha's webinar on the AdWords to Google Ads API migration. If you haven't watched that, I highly recommend it. I won't go into as much detail here, but wanted to make sure I highlight some of the key differences between the two transport methods. Protobufs over gRPC are highly space efficient and result in smaller payloads because they're binary encoded. They also automatically enforce certain data type correctness for requests and responses. For JSON over REST, there's a larger payload size and no data type enforcement, but it's a great tool for debugging and can easily be used ad hoc with tools like curl and Postman. If you use our client libraries, you don't need to worry much about these underlying technologies, but they can be useful to know about when designing your integration. One of the biggest paradigm changes in the Google Ads API is around reporting. I'll give an overview of what's changed, but for more specifics, I recommend watching my colleague Devin's webinar. He goes into greater detail on what the differences are between reporting in the AdWords API versus the Google Ads API, and on constructing a Google Ads query language, or GACL query. We'll also get into much more detail during tomorrow's sessions, flexible reporting, and the ultimate GACL workshop. Having said that, in the Google Ads API, all queries go through a single service, the Google Ads service. Results can be streamed with Google Ads Service.searchStream or paginated with Google Ads Service.search. We recommend using SearchStream over search, especially for large reports, because it avoids unnecessary round trips and because your code can read from a stream before the entire stream is complete. Also, querying is now more flexible with the Google Ads query language, and because of the move from reports to resources. You no longer need to define a report and can instead query resources directly for the data you need. Just pass a GACL query string to search or SearchStream. One thing that's important to note here is that all reports in the Google Ads API are multi-attribution only, which more closely matches the functionality of the UI. As a reminder, with multi-attribution, at most one criterion for each criterion type that triggered the impression will have the impression recorded for it. Each report in the Google Ads API is specific to a criterion type, like keyword, device, or location. When we query the keyword view, for example, each row in the results ties to a single keyword. If we query the geographic view, each row in the results ties to a single country. Because these are two different criterion types, one single impression could be attributed to both or either of them. Because of this behavior, you wouldn't want to aggregate impressions from multiple different criterion type views, since that would lead to double counting. GACL is built to be user-friendly, but it can sometimes be tough to understand, especially when there are so many resources and fields available. To help you out with these challenges, we've built the interactive Google Ads Query Builder. The interactive query builder might look familiar from the AdWords documentation, but this is a completely rewritten version with a lot of improvements. This is available directly in the browser within the Google Ads API developer documentation. It makes it easy to figure out what fields can be selected from a given resource, how you can segment the data, what metrics you can select for that data, and what filters you can apply to narrow down your results. We also now have a GACL query validator available in the developer docs. You can use this to make sure your queries are syntactically valid and that the fields you are accessing are valid for that particular query. For instance, the query validator will show you errors if you try to select add.id from the campaign resource. Valid queries can then be edited using the interactive query builder. While on the topic of reporting, I wanted to note that the Google Ads API has a unified data model, which basically means that objects retrieved through reporting have the same schema as objects submitted to the API for mutates. There will be a session tomorrow that goes into more detail on this, but I'll give a brief overview here. With the unified data model, we can retrieve objects, like campaigns, from the Google Ads API, then directly modify the objects in the response, and send them back to the API in a Mutate request. Let's look at a code example to see how this actually works. So here, we start by fetching campaign IDs and names from the campaign resource using the SearchStream method. SearchStream will return a response containing the results of the query as a list of Google Ads row objects containing the data we queried for. With that, we iterate through each row in the stream response object. We can access the campaign directly from the Google Ads row object, but note that it will only contain the fields that we explicitly selected in our query. In this case, ID, resource name, and name. With the campaign object from the Google Ads row, we can now set the network settings.target search network field to false, and then we make use of another new concept in the Google Ads API, which is the field mask. We use field masks in the Google Ads API to simplify updates by listing only those fields we intend to change with the update. Any fields that are not in the field mask will be ignored. In the Python client library, which you see here, the field mask helper will return a field mask with only the fields that are different between the two arguments. Since we're passing none and a campaign object that's empty except for the ID, resource name, and the newly updated network settings field, those are the only fields that will be updated on the campaign when we make the call to mutate campaigns. Really, we only need to make sure that our field mask includes the resource name of the entity we want to change, which is the unique identifier for that entity, in addition to the fields that we want to update. With that, you can see how simple it is to retrieve an entity through reporting and then mutate that entity directly. And that's thanks to the unified data model. While on the topic of mutates, I wanted to highlight another new feature of the Google Ads API, the Google Ads Service Mutate method. Instead of sending mutates through a resource-specific service, like the campaign service, you can use the Google Ads Service Mutate method to mutate different types of objects in one request. This is different from sending mutates through the batch job service, which was the only bulk mutate option in the AdWords API, and it was asynchronous. Now, in addition to the asynchronous batch job service, we also offer this Google Ads Service Mutate method for making synchronous updates, which is something a lot of you have asked for. Another paradigm change we see in the Google Ads API is strict typing with enums, which we consider best practice for encouraging type safety. In the Google Ads API, types and enumerations were string constants. Now in the Google Ads API, these are actual enumerated constants. By coding against types instead of strings, you can better ensure there are no unexpected values at runtime. We make helper functions available through the client libraries to convert between constant name and constant value, which you can see on the right with PHP's name and value helpers. Before I move on, I want to call out these unspecified and unknown enum values. You may see this in other Google Ads API objects, so they're worth a brief explanation. Unspecified means no value, empty value, or null value, which is necessary with the addition of protobufs. The other option is unknown, which indicates that the client library or server does not have a name defined for the value provided. This can happen if the client library version is different from the server version, such as using the V8 client library after V8.1 has been released. The last paradigm change I'll call out is the restructuring of requests in the Google Ads API. Starting with one you'll get to know well as you interact with the Google Ads API, the login customer ID. In the Google Ads API, we have two customer IDs. The login customer ID is used to authenticate and determines the access level of your request. You set this in your config to the top-level manager account. The other is the client customer ID, which you pass into the request body to access any child account's resources. We think this change will make sub-account access much easier for you. Another structural change in the Google Ads API requests is that the validate only and partial failure fields are now in the header instead of the request body. So in the AdWords API, you would set these fields on the AdWords client itself. But now in the Google Ads API, we can set them on each request we send to the API. This gives you more flexibility for your requests because you can use the same client with different validate only and partial failure parameters. You can see here as well what I meant about the customer ID field. We use this to pass the ID of the child account we want to modify directly into the request body. The login customer ID header would instead contain the ID of an account that manages this customer. Now I want to highlight some of the new and improved features available in the Google Ads API. As a reminder, new features are only coming in the Google Ads API and won't be made available in the AdWords API. Let's start with two of my favorite new features in the Google Ads API, Optimization Score and Recommendations. Optimization Score is an estimate of how well your Google Ads account is set to perform and is available at the customer and campaign levels. The score is given as a percent value, where 100% means that the account or campaign is fully optimized. It's calculated based on a few things, mainly the business objectives you've set, which are inferred from your bidding strategies, the unique data in your account, and Google's forecast models. You can improve your optimization score by applying recommendations. These are generated automatically for you by Google. There are a whole bunch of recommendation types available through the API. Things like keyword recommendations, which recommend specific keywords to add, or responsive search ad, which recommends adding a specific responsive search ad to your campaign. You can fetch recommendations directly from the API by querying the recommendation resource. Here's a simple example in Python. If you wanted to further filter the results to narrow it down to just keyword recommendations, for example, you could filter on recommendation.type and retrieve the keyword recommendation object directly. Once you have that recommendation, you can apply it using the apply recommendation method of the recommendation service. All we need for this is the customer ID for the recommendation and resource name we just got back in our search response. After that recommendation has been applied, you should soon see an increase in your optimization score. This is my favorite new feature because of its combined power and simplicity. It enables you to make a huge impact on your account's overall performance with very little effort. Next up, the Google Ads API adds to the list of available ad and campaign types from the AdWords API. The first of these is hotel ads. These simply weren't available in the AdWords API. The only way to create hotel ads was through the Travel Partner API and Hotel Center. Now, you can use the Google Ads API for the majority of the actions that you would have used the Travel Partner API for. The main actions that you can't use the Google Ads API for are creating, updating, or deleting hotel feeds and hotel pricing information. For these, you still need to use Hotel Center. Hotel ads are available for allow-listed accounts only, so make sure to contact your Google rep if you want to use this feature. My colleagues did an in-depth webinar on hotel ads in the Google Ads API, so make sure you check that out as well for more information. We've also added app engagement ads, which allow you to write text encouraging a specific action in the app, like checking in, making a purchase, or booking a flight. These ads use deep links to send your users to a specific part of your app. Last of the new ad types is shopping comparison listing ads. This is available to all comparison shopping services participating in the CSS program in Europe, and these can be created as part of a shopping campaign. On the campaign front, we have two new types. The first is local campaigns, which help achieve offline-only performance goals like store visits and in-store sales. These are run across search, maps, YouTube, and display. In order to create a local campaign, you'll have to select which store locations you want to promote. These can be locations within your Google My Business account, or affiliate locations, which denote nearby stores, primarily chains, that sell your products. Quick call out that maximize conversion value, which provides an optional target return on ad spend setting, is the only bidding strategy supported for local campaigns. Portfolio bidding strategies are not allowed for this campaign type. Local campaigns also require that you set at least one optimization goal between call clicks and driving directions. The second of our two new campaign types is Smart Campaigns, which is currently in beta. Smart Campaigns require minimal setup and optimize themselves based on both your business goals and on the data Google collects about how customers are interacting with the ads. They show ads across search, Maps, YouTube, Gmail, and Google partner websites. Each Smart Campaign can have only one ad group, but multiple ads. Each ad can have up to 2 descriptions and 3 headlines, which might be combined to create new ads based on what Google learns about how the different combinations perform. There's also a new entity called Smart Campaign Setting, which contains additional config options that aren't available on the campaign object, such as final URL, language code, phone number, and business name or Google My Business location ID. The Smart Campaign Setting object gets associated with the Smart Campaign by referencing the campaign ID in its resource name. The Google Ads API also exposes 2 services that make recommendations for settings when creating Smart Campaigns: Keyword Theme Constant Service and Smart Campaign Suggest Service. With the Keyword Theme Constant Service, you provide a keyword, region code, and language code, and you get back a list of keyword theme constants, which you can use as search campaign criterion. So for example, if I provide the keyword pizzeria, I might get back a list containing values like pizza near me and local pizzeria. With the Smart Campaign Suggest service, you can then plug in those keyword theme constants, as well as some other details about your business, like final URL, location, and business schedule, and you get back a few things. You get 3 tiers of budget recommendations: low, high, and recommended. And with each of those budget recommendations, you get an estimated minimum and maximum number of daily clicks that the budget would entail. Moving on, the Google Ads API brings several improvements to billing and introduces a new API feature, Invoices. I'll start with some overarching billing improvements. In the AdWords API, in order to use the budget order service to manage billing, you had to request that the authenticating user be allowed listed. This could get pretty tedious, especially for large-scale account hierarchies. In the Google Ads API, no allow listing is required. Whichever account you pass in as the login customer ID is what decides your billing access. Another huge improvement is with regards to transparency in billing. Specifically, the error messages are far clearer and easier to interpret. So in the AdWords API, you might have seen ambiguous messaging like generic billing error, versus in the Google Ads API, where you have all these specific billing errors that provide a much more actionable name and description. This isn't even all of them, which isn't to say that there are more ways to go wrong, but rather more information available when something does go wrong. And in addition to that, we've made the billing setup status available through the API to give you a clearer picture on the state of your billing. The last billing improvement that I wanted to call out is that you can now manage billing setups directly through the API. A billing setup represents a link between a Google Ads account and a payments account. Be careful not to confuse this with a billing setup in the UI, which maps to a payments account in the API. The API billing setup is specific to an ad account and represents the link between that ad account and a payments account. With that cleared up, I want to talk about another new feature in the Google Ads API, Invoices. This is another new feature that I'm pretty excited about because it's one a lot of AdWords API users asked for. With Invoices, you can retrieve monthly invoice details, including a link to download the invoice PDF. To list invoices, you need the customer ID of an advertiser account, the resource name of the billing setup, which as you now know is that link between the payments account and the advertiser account, and an issue month and year. In addition to all of the invoice and account budget related fields returned in this response, you can separately send an HTTP request to the URL in the PDF URL field of the returned invoice objects to download a PDF copy of the invoice. We also now have some new API services available for retrieving change history. In the AdWords API, this was only possible with the customer sync service, which didn't provide as much granularity. The first of these services is the change status service. This can be used to retrieve a sort of summary of the changes that have been made within an account. You can narrow down your search by resource type and date range and query for the resource name of the entity that was changed, the date time of the last change, and whether that change was an addition, modification, or removal. For AdWords API users familiar with the customer sync service, I want to point out a key difference. In the AdWords API, all changes in a given customer or campaign hierarchy were provided in a single nested object, which you would have needed to unpack to access the changes to ad groups and ads. In the Google Ads API, these changes are unpacked for you so that you get a row for each level in the hierarchy that was affected by the change. Now, if we want to get more specific about what the change was or which user the change was made by, that's where the change event service comes in handy. With the change event service, we can get details that might be useful for auditing, like the user email and the client type that the change was made through. If the change was an update operation, we can also get specific details about what the entity looked like before and after the change. Next, we have some new services for account management. In the AdWords API, user access was manageable only through the UI, which made it tough to manage individual permissions and user invitations at scale. Now it's possible to invite users to Google Ads account and manage that user's permissions entirely through the API. There are two new services to enable this: Customer User Access Invitation Service, which allows for creation and removal of user access invitations, and the Customer User Access Service, which manages the access role of a user on a given customer. As you can see, the access roles provided through the API mirror the access levels available through the UI. This vastly simplifies the process of managing user access, which unlocks more scalability and security for your Google Ads accounts. Okay, now on to keyword planning. This isn't new in the Google Ads API, but there are some improvements I'd like to call out. The first is that keyword planning service is now more consistent with the Google Ads UI. The most obvious manifestation of this is in the naming. In the AdWords API, you would do keyword planning and retrieve historic metrics with the targeting idea service, and use the traffic estimator service to retrieve forecast metrics. In the Google Ads API, you'll use the keyword plan idea service to generate keyword ideas, and the keyword plan service to generate historic and forecast metrics. In general, the mapping of fields and functionality from the UI keyword planner and the keyword planning services offered through the Google Ads API is more clear than it was for the AdWords API. The new API terminology is pretty easily linked with the components of the UI keyword planner. Here you can see how API terminology maps to the UI when the Start with a Website tab is selected. Site seed, URL seed, geo-target constants, and language fields all map one-to-one with UI inputs. Alternatively, when the Start with Keywords tab is selected, you start with a keyword seed and have the option of narrowing your planning with an additional URL seed. These fields are all mapped in our documentation as well, so I recommend you make use of that tool as you use the keyword plan service. But until you do that, let this be evidence that the translation between the keyword planner and the UI and the API is now very intuitive. There are also some new parameters that are available for keyword planning, which you might have noticed on the previous slides. There's include adult keywords to set whether to include adult keyword ideas, and there's keyword annotation, which allows you to refine keywords by their relevance to a given concept. So for example, if you're a skincare company selling lotion, you can refine the results to include only those keywords that are related to dry skin. Next, we have assets. AdWords users will know this isn't a new feature, but it does bring with it some important changes in the Google Ads API. The first change to highlight is the migration from feed-based extensions to asset-based extensions. My colleague Andrew will be leading the next workshop, which will focus specifically on this migration. So I'll just give a short overview and recommend that you attend that workshop for a more in-depth look at this change. If you can't attend that workshop, you'll be able to view a recording afterwards. The feed-based to asset-based extension migration has 2 waves currently planned for the extension types listed here. Feed-based extensions will be automatically migrated to asset-based extensions on October 20th of this year and February 15th of next year for the 2 respective waves. After that, you won't be able to mutate or create feed-based extensions. If you need to, you can choose to opt out of the October 20th auto migration in favor of the February 15th and April 8th sunset dates. Andrew will talk through more of those details in his workshop, so stay tuned for that. I want to also call out that compared to feed-based extensions, asset-based extensions are much simpler to work with. So I think you'll find that the time and complexity savings of this migration are worth the investment. Make sure you have a plan to migrate your feed-based extensions to asset-based extensions, since all extensions will soon become asset-based extensions. We recommend that you migrate yourself instead of relying on the auto migration so that you can maintain any necessary associations in your extension solution. Check out the Migrating Extensions page in our documentation for guidance and examples on how to migrate your feed-based extensions. On the topic of assets, Google Ads API introduces some new metrics on assets. For one, we have performance label, available through the Ad Group Ad Asset view. This field gives insight into the performance of this specific asset ad pairing. Take note that the Ad Group Ad Asset view only contains information about assets that are related to app ads. In the AdWords API, there was no reporting on assets at all, so no way to measure performance at the asset level. In the Google Ads API, we make asset metrics available through a few different resources: Ad Group Asset, Campaign Asset, and Customer Asset, and the app ad specific resource I mentioned on the previous slide. With these resources, you can query for asset metrics at each respective level. For example, with the Ad Group Asset resource, we can segment by ad group ID to get the number of clicks and impressions for each ad group asset combination. Considering asset reporting wasn't available at all in the AdWords API, this is a huge improvement and will unlock a lot of asset performance insights. Next, and lastly of the new and improved features I'll talk about, there have been a lot of changes to bidding strategies in the Google Ads API. I'll mention a couple of them that I think are most impactful. In the AdWords API, bidding strategies could only be shared within an account, meaning that they had to be replicated and maintained across multiple accounts if you wanted to use the same bidding strategy across those accounts. Now in the Google Ads API, we have cross-account bidding strategies, which can be used to share bidding strategies across multiple accounts in a given MCC hierarchy. Using the bidding strategy service, we create a bidding strategy operation, which sets the name, the currency code, which will default to the manager's default currency, and the bidding scheme, which in this case is target spend. That operation gets sent in a request where the customer ID is the manager customer ID, so that bidding strategy will then be accessible to all client accounts under that manager. One of the new bidding strategies available is the target impression share bidding strategy. This strategy helps ensure your ads are meeting a specific impression share threshold for a specific location on the search results page, between anywhere, top of page, or absolute top of page. So we configure a few things here. The location on the search results page that we want to target, which is either anywhere on the page, among the top results on the page, or at the very top of the page. Then there's the impression share target, which is the percentage of impressions we want to achieve in that location, and the max cost per click bid limit that the automated bidding system is permitted to specify. With this new bidding strategy, It's easy to understand where ads are appearing and to measure performance across different locations on the page. We can easily fetch this data from the bidding strategy resource using a GACL query like the one shown. Target impression share is also available for campaign bid simulations, which help you to predict how performance will differ based on your budget and bid ceiling. Those were all of the new and improved features I wanted to highlight, but it's not even close to covering it, and there are always new and improved features coming. We've talked about a lot in this workshop, so I hope you'll walk away with a better handle on what's new in the Google Ads API. Before we wrap up, I wanted to share a few next steps to get the ball rolling on your Google Ads API integration. If you want a more detailed log of all of the changes in the Google Ads API, have a look at the release notes in our developer documentation. Also, subscribe to our blog for announcements. If you haven't already, begin planning your migration to the Google Ads API using the many tools available in our documentation and on our YouTube channel, which I've linked to at the end of the presentation. My colleague, Sasha, will also be doing a workshop that gives you some pointers on how to plan your migration, so definitely check that out. And on that note, stick around for the rest of our workshops. We put a lot of time into making this content relevant and helpful to you as you move to the Google Ads API, so I hope you'll take advantage. And with that, we've reached the end of the workshop. Thanks everyone for joining, and I really hope you found this to be a good use of your time. As a parting gift, I wanted to share a list of resources that are available to help you with the Google Ads API, on top of the many that I've mentioned so far. As I mentioned, here you can find the link to our YouTube channel, which is where you can find all of our webinars in addition to the ones that I've linked in the slides. I've also included links to our developer docs. These are some of the pages that you might want to bookmark for your migration. I strongly suggest you check these out before you start your migration and reference them as you go. Also take note of the support resources, so if you run into any blockers as you migrate, these will definitely come in handy. Alrighty, I hope this webinar itself has been a useful resource to you. Thanks everyone for joining.